Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns. For 10 long years he had fought beneath the walls of Troy. The war was won at last, the city in ashes, and all he wanted was the road home. But the sea is wide, the gods are watching, and home is farther than any map can show. This is the story of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, and the longest journey ever told, the Odyssey. Composed almost 3,000 years ago in 12,000 lines of verse, it is Homer's epic of a war's end, a long road home, and the wife who waited. It began with a trick, a great wooden horse left at the gates, Greek soldiers hidden in its belly, and by nightfall Troy was burning. After 10 years of war, the proud city had finally fallen, and the long siege was over. Odysseus loaded 12 ships with his men and pushed off into the wine-dark sea, his heart light, certain that rocky Ithaca lay just over the horizon. He could not have known that 20 years would pass before he saw it, or that of all these men, he alone would come home. Their first stop set the pattern. Flushed with victory, the men fell on the coastal town of the Cicones, seized its plunder and wine, and then, instead of slipping away, lingered to feast on the beach. By dawn, the Cicones had returned with hardened warriors from inland. They fell on the drunken Greeks and drove them to their ships, and Odysseus lost 6 men from every crew before they could row clear. Already the sea was teaching them its price. A storm drove them to a drowsy, golden shore, the land of the lotus eaters. The people there meant no harm. They only offered the sweet lotus fruit. But one taste, and a man forgot his home, his wife, his own name, wanting nothing but to lie in that haze forever. Odysseus found his men weeping when he tried to lead them away. He had to drag them back to the ships by force and bind them beneath the rowing benches, hauling them off before the whole crew forgot why they were sailing at all. Next, they reached an island of giants and found a vast cave stocked with cheeses and pens of lambs. Curious, Odysseus and a few men crept inside to wait for its owner, never guessing he was Polyphemus, a one-eyed Cyclops and a son of the sea god Poseidon. At dusk, the giant drove his flocks in and rolled a boulder across the mouth of the cave, a stone no men could move. Then he spotted his guests. He snatched 2 of them up, dashed them to the ground, and devoured them whole, and went on eating the men 2 at a time. Trapped, Odysseus turned to cunning. He offered the giant strong, dark wine until his eye grew heavy, and when Polyphemus drowsily asked his name, Odysseus answered, "Nobody. My name is Nobody." That night, as the monsters sprawled in a drunken sleep, they heated a sharpened stake until it glowed, then drove it deep into his single eye and leaned on it with all their weight. The cave filled with his howling. His screams brought the other Cyclopes running to the cave. "Who is hurting you?" they shouted through the rock. "Nobody," he roared back. "Nobody is killing me." And so, hearing no name worth their trouble, they shrugged and wandered away. At dawn, the blind giant rolled back the stone and felt the back of each sheep as it passed, certain his prisoners would try to ride out. But Odysseus had lashed his men beneath the bellies of the woolly rams, and they slipped out under the monster's groping hands. Safe at sea, pride got the better of him. Odysseus shouted his true name across the water so the giant would know who had beaten him. It was a fatal mistake. Polyphemus lifted his hands to his father Poseidon and prayed that Odysseus would reach home late, alone, and broken. For a while, fortune smiled. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, welcomed them warmly and gave Odysseus a parting gift, a great leather bag holding every stormy wind, tied tight so that only one gentle breeze remained to carry the ships home. 9 days and nights they sailed on that soft wind, Odysseus himself holding the line, never once sleeping. On the 10th day the cliffs of Ithaca rose ahead, so close they could see the watchfires burning on the shore of home. Then exhaustion took him, and he slept. His curious crew, certain the bag was full of hidden gold, untied it. Every storm wind screamed loose at once, and a shrieking gale seized the ships and blew them all the way back to where they had started. Aeolus turned them away the second time, certain they were cursed. So they rowed on and came to a still harbor ringed by towering cliffs, the country of the Laestrygonians. One by one, the ships filed into the calm water and moored together, snug and unsuspecting. They were cannibal giants. They leaned over the heights and rained down boulders, smashing the hulls, then speared the drowning men like fish. 11 ships were lost in a few terrible moments. Only Odysseus's own ship, moored outside the harbor, cut its line and escaped. One ship now, and a single weary crew. They landed on Aiaia, the island of the witch goddess Circe. She welcomed a scouting party with wine and honeyed bread, then touched them with her wand and turned them into grunting swine, herding them squealing into her pens. One man fled back with the news. Odysseus marched to the rescue alone, and on the path the god Hermes met him and gave him a secret herb called moly to break her magic. When Circe's wand failed against him, she fell back astonished and set his men free. For a full year Circe sheltered them, feasting and resting on her island, the horrors of the sea almost forgotten. But Ithaca still pulled at them, and at last the men begged Odysseus to sail. Before she let him go, Circe told him there was one more place he must visit first. She sent him where no living man should sail, to the very edge of the world, to the misty gates of the underworld. There, Odysseus dug a trench and made his offerings, and the pale shades of the dead came drifting up out of the dark to meet him. Among them he found his own mother, who had died of grief waiting for him, and 3 times he reached to hold her, and 3 times she slipped through his arms like smoke. He saw old comrades from the war, and Agamemnon, murdered the very day he came home. He met the shade of mighty Achilles, the greatest of all the Greek warriors. And Achilles told him the bleakest truth of all, that he would rather be a poor man's hired hand under the warm sun than rule as a king over all the breathless dead. Then came the blind prophet Tiresias, the one he had crossed the world to find. Odysseus could still reach home, the prophet said, though late and broken, having lost everyone, but only on one condition, that his men leave the cattle of the sun god untouched. Back in the world of the living, the true gauntlet began. First the Sirens, whose song was so sweet that every sailor who heard it steered onto the rocks and died. Odysseus longed to hear it and live, so he sealed his men's ears with beeswax and had them lash him tight to the mast. Next came a narrow strait with death on either side. On one cliff lurked Scylla, a shrieking monster with 6 long necks and 6 ravenous heads. Below the other churned Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallowed the whole sea down and spat it back 3 times a day. To steer near the whirlpool was to lose everyone, so, as Circe had warned him, Odysseus hugged Scylla's cliff instead. As they rowed past, her 6 heads darted down and snatched 6 of his men, lifting them screaming into the air. It was the hardest sight of all his voyage. At last they reached Thrinacia, where the sun god's sacred cattle grazed. Remember the warning, do not touch them. But foul winds pinned the ship for weeks, the food ran out, and one day while Odysseus slept, his starving men slaughtered the forbidden herd and roasted it on the shore. The sun god demanded justice, and Zeus answered. The moment they sailed from the island, a black storm rose, and a single thunderbolt split the ship to pieces. Every last man drowned. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to the broken keel, swept alone across the open sea. He washed ashore on Ogygia, the island of the nymph Calypso, who loved him and would not let him leave. She offered him eternal youth, ageless and deathless, if only he would stay. For 7 long years he stayed, and every day he sat on the shore and wept, gazing out toward home. High on Olympus, the goddess Athena could bear his suffering no longer. She stood before Zeus and the council of the gods and pleaded for the forgotten king, until Zeus sent the messenger Hermes down to Calypso with a command she could not refuse: let Odysseus go. On a raft he built himself, Odysseus put to sea, and Poseidon wrecked him one last time. Half drowned, he crawled ashore in the land of the Phaeacians, where a kind young princess named Nausicaa found him and brought the ragged stranger to her father's court. At the king's feast, a bard began to sing of Troy, and the stranger hid his face and wept. At last he spoke his name: I am Odysseus. And there, to that hushed and astonished hall, he told the whole long tale of the sea that you have just heard. Moved by his story, the Phaeacians filled a ship with treasure and carried him home at last. Odysseus slept the whole crossing, and they laid him gently on the sand of Ithaca with his gifts beside him. After 20 years, he was finally home, though he hardly dared believe it. But his house was full of danger, and Odysseus could not simply walk into his palace. So Athena met him on the shore and wrapped him in the disguise of an old, ragged beggar, bent and gray, so he could move unseen among his enemies and learn who had stayed loyal. He went first to the hut of Eumaeus, his old swineherd, who took the stranger in, shared his food, and spoke warmly of the master he believed long dead, cursing the men who were ruining the house, never dreaming that master sat at his own fire. There his son Telemachus came, a grown man now, just returned from his own search for news of his father. When they were alone, Odysseus let the disguise fall and revealed himself. Father and son wept and embraced, and together they began to plan their revenge. As the disguised king crossed his own courtyard, an old dog lifted his head from a heap of dung. It was Argos, the puppy Odysseus had raised before sailing to war, now ancient and neglected. The dog knew his master at once. He thumped his tail and laid his head down and died. Inside, more than 100 suitors had taken over the hall for years, devouring his herds and pressing his wife Penelope to remarry. She had held them off by cunning, promising to choose once she finished weaving a burial shroud, then secretly unraveling her work every single night. At last her trick was discovered, and her time ran out. So Penelope set a contest. She would marry whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot a single arrow clean through the rings of 12 axe heads set in a row. One after another the suitors took up the bow and heaved with all their strength, and not one could even bend it enough to slip on the string. They warmed it at the fire and rubbed it with grease, and still the great bow defeated them. Then the old beggar asked for a turn, and the suitors jeered. But he took the bow and strung it as easily as a poet fits a string to his harp, and the bowstring sang out clear and sharp as a swallow's cry. His first arrow flew straight through all 12 axes. Then Odysseus threw off his rags and stood revealed, the king come home. "You dogs," he cried, "you never thought I would return." And with Telemachus at his side and Athena lending her power, he turned the bow on the suitors and did not stop until the hall was cleared. One test remained, the hardest of all. Penelope, afraid to hope, would not believe this man was her husband, and quietly ordered their marriage bed moved out of the bedroom. Odysseus flared up. That bed could never be moved, for he had built it himself around the trunk of a living olive tree, rooted in the earth. Only the two of them had ever known. And so, at last, she knew him. After 20 years, they fell into each other's arms and wept. Odysseus found his aged father too, and when the suitors' angry kinsmen rose against him, the goddess Athena stepped between them and made peace. Ithaca was whole again. 20 years, 12 ships down to none. A war, a curse, monsters, witches, gods, and the dead. Everything Odysseus had was stripped away on the long road home. And yet, what carried him past the Sirens, past Calypso's offer of immortality, past every easy escape, was the simplest thing of all. An ordinary house, on a rocky little island, with the people he loved still in it. That is the Odyssey, the oldest adventure we still tell, because we are all, in some way, trying to find our way home. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales brought to life. Thank you for watching.